troubled waters, the U.S. sounds the alarm on China's land reclamation projects in the disputed South China Sea. There are growing fears that Beijing's island building project is for military purposes and could destabilize the region. So, should this be cause for concern? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. Out of step with international law. That's how the U.S. describes China's latest actions in the South China Sea. Speaking at the Asia-Pacific Security Summit, the U.S. Defense Secretary voiced deep concerns about the scale of Beijing's island building in the disputed territory. China says the criticism is not constructive and insists its activities are legitimate. But there are fears that the dispute could escalate into a conflict. We'll speak to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Al Jazeera's Margot Ortigas, who's at the meeting in Singapore.
Angering the Chinese, a U.S. patrol plane flies over disputed waters in the South China Sea and captures just a portion of the Chinese reclamation in the area. China has built at least 7 man-made islets, over 800 hectares, where once there was only rocky outcrop. The U.S. calls the activity unprecedented. At an Asia-Pacific Security Conference in Singapore, Ashton Carter, the U.S. Defense Secretary, criticized China's aggressiveness.
With its actions in the South China Sea, China is out of step with both the international rules and norms that underscore the Asia-Pacific security architecture and the regional consensus that favors diplomacy and opposes coercion.
China disagrees and has ignored pleas for its controversial construction to stop. As far as China is concerned, it is the United States that is causing trouble.
It is groundless to criticize China for affecting regional peace and stability through construction activities, since China has never taken any proactive measure. In fact, the disputes in the South China Sea has been there for decades. And over the past decades, the region has been peaceful and stable just because China's great restraint.
The Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, 3 of 5 other claimants to the disputed waters, also have their own installations, but nothing on the scale of China's reclamation. The Philippines has brought the dispute to an international tribunal for arbitration. But China has refused to participate in the proceedings, maintaining it has historical sovereignty.
The Chinese aren't quite trusted, I think simply because on the face of it, it appears that the Chinese will say one thing and in action do quite another. And I think it doesn't quite square off. I think this is where the confusion lies and where the mistrust really lies.
The U.S. and its allies fear that the struggle over ownership of the South China Sea could destabilize peace in the Asia-Pacific and affect trade and security in the rest of the world. Margot Ortigas reporting for Inside Story.
Well, 6 countries are embroiled in the dispute, which centers around the Paracel and Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. China, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam and Taiwan have overlapping claims to this territory, but Beijing claims most of it. Although the islands are mostly uninhabited, they sit on vast oil and gas fields, as well as some of the region's best fishing grounds. And control over the islands would also mean control over vital shipping routes. $5 trillion worth of seaborne trade passes through these disputed waters every year. Let's bring in now our guests for today's Inside Story. From Singapore, Malcolm Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. From Hong Kong, we have Andrew Lung, who's a China analyst and foreign policy specialist. And in New Jersey, in the United States, Gordon Chang, who's a foreign policy analyst, a U.S. foreign policy analyst and author who focuses on East Asia. Thank you very much indeed for being with us on Inside Story today. Andrew Lung in Hong Kong, if I may start with you. For decades now, China has done little to enforce its sweeping claim to the South China Sea. Why is that changing now Why, despite the audible concerns from the U.S. and its neighbors?
Well, as the Chinese officials were making the point, the China's claim of some of these islands have been for a long, long time. But because in the early decades, China was rather weak. And in fact, territorial integrity has been a very, very sore point in China's national psyche, China having suffered centuries of humiliation and foreign aggression. So now China is more powerful and has in a position to defend its claims. And in fact, China is not the first country building features over some of the disputed islets or drilling in disputed waters.
They're not the only ones, Andrew, but
China. So
they're not the only ones, as you say, Andrew. But recently released satellite images
not on the same scale, yes.
show that there's a dramatic expansion in China's construction of artificial islands, including an airstrip that appears to be large enough to accommodate fighter jets. What is the ultimate purpose here? What is the objective? What are they trying to do?
Well, I think China is trying to strengthen its claims, bearing in mind, of course, China is not a major maritime power, as in the case of the United States. And when China is in a position to do so, China would like to, of course, want to strengthen its claims. But also, the South China Sea, of course, is a very important conduit of the trade and also importation of oil and natural resources, which is, of course, China's lifeblood. So that, of course, all these island chains, as it were, are part of China's security architecture. So naturally, China wants to build sort of larger sites, possibly for military planes. But also China has made clear that there's also, these constructions will include lighthouses and also search and rescue facilities, which could be made available to other countries, including the United States.
Okay.
But the most important point is that these constructions, are they threatening civilian navigation? And obviously not yet.
Okay, Malcolm Cook in Singapore, is China in the right over their claims to these islands? Is their reclamation legal?
The legal status of the different islands and rocks in the South China Sea isn't clear at all and has never been ruled on. But as your report noted, the Philippines has tried to get a ruling that may come out next year in an international tribunal, and China has refused to recognize the jurisdiction. And China also probably would refuse to take these territorial disputes to the International Court of Justice. So at the moment, the Chinese position is not to let international law make a judgment on the sovereignty. There's probably one other point. Many of the islands that China is building are based upon features that are underwater at high tide. Natural features underwater at high tide, even if you have sovereignty over them, you cannot claim territorial waters for them. All you can claim is a 500-meter safety zone. So the recent calls by the Chinese Navy for the U.S. flights not to interfere into what they claim were Chinese territorial waters is probably not legal.
Okay, so legally they're not in the right. Gordon Chang in New Jersey. Every year, of course, U.S.-China tensions take center stage at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore this year. But just how much concern is there right now in the U.S. about the Chinese activities in the South China Sea? Do they feel that a red line has been crossed?
Well, I think there is a feeling that a red line has been crossed, because when that P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance craft approached Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratly Islands, the Chinese referred to a military alert zone that they had established, which looks like an air defense identification zone in international waters. They told the Poseidon to go away. That clearly is an infringement on freedom of navigation. And as we just heard, China is claiming a territorial band of waters 12 nautical miles from these features, which was not permitted under the UN Conventional Law of Sea or customary international law. You know, the United States has always defended the global commons, And so when China infringes on that, there certainly is a red line that people think China has crossed.
As you know, Gordon, the Chinese say that this dispute has existed now for decades and that they've always shown restraint. That is the Americans who are instead engaging in provocation right now with these surveillance flights that you mentioned.
Well, these surveillance flights are in international airspace. The United States has shown restraint. We did not do anything when China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in early 2012. And we have not done a number of things to defend freedom of navigation. Now there is concern in Washington and in other capitals, not only in the region but around the world. And that is why this is coming to a head at this particular time, because China's made it clear that it is going to infringe on the right to travel on international water and airspace. So I think restraint in the past has shown the Chinese there is no cost to further provocation. And so they've been more provocative. And now at some point, I think that countries around the world have said enough is enough.
Andrew Long in Hong Kong, you've just heard what Gordon said there. A lot of countries expressing concern. Is China hearing any of this? Are they open to a dialogue over this issue?
No, I think China's well aware of all these concerns, and of course, it's, through diplomatic channels, has also been talking to a number of them. But I think that there is no way that China would give up her claims. In fact, there are other claimants equally not giving up theirs as well. But I think the situation needs to be managed very, very carefully. Neither China nor, of course, the United States or any countries in the region want to have an military confrontation, because once something happens, it's very difficult to control. So I think that the idea is how to manage the situation, but to avoid unnecessary and unwanted misunderstanding or miscalculations. And then the posturing on both sides, there is a danger of the so-called security dilemma, which can spiral out of control. So I think it's quite helpful. For example, recently China said, well, they are also building lighthouses and search and rescue facilities, and these could be made available to other countries. But I think another possibility is to consider the possibility of joint development and joint management of resources. I think that China at some point did mention this idea. I think that needs to be further pursued.
Sure.
But of course, the more dialogue and more sort of open negotiations would be useful as well.
When you say more dialogue and that China is not interested in confrontation, but nonetheless, I mean, the Communist Party reclassified the South China Sea as a core national interest, and this was back in 2012. If this is a core national interest, it means that China perhaps is prepared to fight for it, is it not?
Well, naturally, the South China Sea, as I was saying in the beginning, is of vital interest to China. Don't forget, apart from territorial claims, a large part of the shipping passes through the South China Sea, particularly through the choke points in the Malacca Strait, for example, which is controlled by an American 7th Fleet. So, and then shipping carries the not only trade, but the oil and resources, which is China's economic lifeblood. So that threatens the very stability of China. So naturally, there's a core interest, but it doesn't mean that China would necessarily threaten civilian navigation in the South China Sea. But of course, China is also trying to develop relations with its neighbors. And then for example, before the introduction of the Asian pivot, the whole South China Sea, I mean, there was no, the only disputes like this only happened during the past 10 years or so.
Okay.
I think that when China's becoming more and more influential in the region.
Let's bring in Malcolm now in Singapore. Malcolm, Andrew there says that China is not looking for a confrontation, that it's interested in developing relations with its neighbors. Do you agree with that? Do the facts on the ground support this?
Recently, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs made the points that Andrew did and then called the Philippines a small state and argued that small states like the Philippines shouldn't persistently provoke large states, even though the Philippines was simply repeating their long-standing sovereign claims in the South China Sea through diplomatic and legal means, not through military means. Also, the argument that the very large military-scale land reclamation activities are for peaceful purposes of search and rescue would not match with the fact that the Chinese military has already put weapons on those islands, including potentially anti-aircraft guns. If you're building something for search and rescue and peaceful use by all countries, then I don't think you would put anti-aircraft weapons on it so quickly. So I think the Chinese are certainly being seen by not only the other smaller claimants in Southeast Asia as being militarily provocative, but many other countries that rely on that.
What about these other claimants?
Navigation is not only for civilian
purposes. Okay, what about these other claimants that you mentioned and Andrew also mentioned, like Vietnam? Does this set a precedent for them, the fact that China is engaging in such actions in the South China Sea?
I guess if you look, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, which has maritime boundary disputes with China in the South China Sea, do not have the capability to take on any scale of reclamation like China is undertaking now. So China is quantitatively and qualitatively doing things that no other claimant can do. And I certainly think the Philippines would disagree with the argument that the Chinese have only started to up the pressure after the U.S. announced the rebalance. They might go back to 1995, and the Vietnamese might go back to 1988, where they lost 62 naval officers in a military conflict with China in disputed waters.
Gordon Chang in New Jersey, we know what's at stake for China and its neighboring countries, but what about the U.S.? What is at stake for them, and how would a dispute in this region affect the U.S. not just economically, but also politically?
For the United States, if there's been any consistent foreign policy over the course of 2 centuries, it has been the defense of freedom of navigation. And so this is a core American policy. The global commons is important to the United States and also to the open architecture, which it sponsored after the end of the Second World War, which has allowed this prosperity in Asia to occur. So this is where the United States has an interest. Of course, it doesn't have an interest in any rock or reef. We don't have territorial claims. But the problem is, if you allow China to close off 80% of the South China Sea, then other countries will do so in other waters, and we will have a very different international system, one that is not open and one that is very different from the way it is today.
Well, the U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter is calling on all parties involved in the South China Sea dispute to stop reclamation efforts and seek a peaceful resolution. Take a listen.
The United States is deeply concerned about the pace and scope of land reclamation in the South China Sea, the prospect of further militarization, as well as the potential for these activities to increase the risk of miscalculation or conflict among claimant states. As a Pacific nation, a trading nation, and a member of the international community, the United States has every right to be involved and concerned.
Gordon Chang, you heard there, the U.S. deeply concerned, as we've said. What options does the U.S. have today in deterring China, Gordon?
I think what the United States will eventually do is to fly over these features to show that this is international airspace and to drive ships through the 12-mile nautical zone that China claims and which I think is unjustifiable. And probably what we'll see is not just the United States do this, but other nations as well, as a demonstration that this is not just a U.S. issue, this is also an issue for other nations in the region. Because the United States is responding to pressure from other countries to basically show some leadership, which it hadn't done for quite a long time. So this is a regional issue, not just an American one.
Andrew Lang, how might China respond to what the U.S. might do that Gordon just mentioned there, these surveillance flights and so on, and if other countries are also involved, might China see this as a threat, and how will they respond?
Well, of course, China's building all these facilities there, not only for civilian purposes, obviously, because China, as I was saying in the beginning, wants to strengthen its claims. And strengthen the claims means building defense, military defense facilities, including anti-aircraft armory. So this is understandable, particularly, as I was saying in the beginning, territorial integrity has been a very, very sore point in China's national psyche. So if all the claimants, of course, has a right to defend their claim, but if you see that these claims are being militarily challenged, then I think there is a possibility for unwanted escalation. I mean, China made it quite clear.
What do you mean by unwanted escalation? What do you mean exactly by unwanted escalation?
Well, in the sense, when I said unwanted, neither the United States nor China wants and can afford a war which can escalate out of proportion. And neither country wants it. So that's unwanted. But escalation is inevitable because I was saying that if both sides take postures which threatens the other side's core interests in an open and aggressive way, then there is a formula for escalation. So it's naturally, I think if neither country wants this, the way to handle this is how to manage the situation and create emergency mechanisms to minimize the risk for unwanted miscalculations and misunderstanding, but also build on mutual trust rather than exacerbating mutual misunderstanding.
Malcolm Cook, what do you respond to that? Andrew says escalation is inevitable. What's your view on that? Is there a likelihood today of a direct confrontation between China and the US in the South China Sea?
I think the likelihood is greater. I don't think it's a guarantee, but clearly these massive land reclamation activities put into direct threat for the first time in a U.S. point of view, but shared by Japan, Australia, and many others, the freedom of navigation, which includes in international waters military vessels as well. So now, through the militarization of the South China Sea, China is putting itself in direct confrontation with, as Gordon noted, a global U.S. interest. And so for the first time, the fears of the U.S. and China having a fundamental disagreement in the South China Sea is coming to bear because of China's massive land reclamation activities and its claims for territorial seas and airs around them.
Okay, Gordon Chang, very briefly, you have the last word. There is no Asian NATO. There's no formal security architecture in this region. So how do you think this dispute can be resolved?
Well, I think it's going to be resolved through countries working with the United States, trying to convince China that there is no solution for their territorial claims, that they'll have to litigate them, and that they'll have to discuss them with countries in the region. But, you know, I'm afraid that this will escalate because China has said war is inevitable.
Okay, war is inevitable. We'll leave it on that note, which is not a very optimistic one, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Malcolm Cook in Singapore, Andrew Leung in Hong Kong, and Gordon Chang in New Jersey. And thank you as well for watching this edition of Inside Story. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts. You can contact us on our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Foliba Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.